At 15 seconds, guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
In today's world, most people don't realize that false doctrines are just as dangerous as a physical war. When false doctrines are presented, they harm others and cause much destruction. And when those who bring forth these type of battles, there also must be a defense to stop the harming of innocent lives. Shalom and welcome back. This is Avram Ben Shalom. Today I want to focus on a very important topic, which is going to be dealing with the one law theology versus the two house theology. And we have to really understand the fact that this doctrine of one law theology and two house theology is literally one and the same belief. The only difference is the coding of this belief has a different color, a different texture, but inside it's the same garbage, okay? And this is what we have to understand with the difference of one law versus two house theology. So let's break down and understand what the one law and two house theology believe in and why they're completely false and are not according to the actual scriptures. Number one, the one law theology is as follows. It believes that people become a part of the covenant of Moses through the belief of Mashiach Yahushua. Okay, false. Why is this a false doctrine? Believing in Mashiach Yahushua does not enter you into a covenant which involves the covenant of Moses. This is a complete false belief. It's a complete false understanding of the Bible and the New Testament. Mashiach Yahushua's covenant is plainly simple. It is a covenant of salvation. It's the covenant by which in our faith in God's salvation, Mashiach Yahushua, in our hope in Mashiach Yahushua, who died for our sins and rose from the grave, our understanding that we have to have completely centered is knowing that salvation is coming by faith. That means that we are accepting that we are sinners. We are accepting that we are born in sin. We are accepting that we sin. And we're accepting the fact that we cannot produce righteousness in order to create salvation. We have to understand the fact of why is it we cannot produce righteousness in order to create salvation. You have to look at it from the standpoint of this, okay? You take, for example, a machine. A machine is broken. It cannot work, it cannot function because it is broken. So what this machine does, it only functions in the state of its broken state. Can the machine fix itself? No, it needs somebody to fix it. By being fixed, it now can function. Okay, we are all born in a state of dysfunction. We are born in a state of sin. We cannot change our behavior and act as if by changing our behavior that we can create within ourselves a functional state of being. All we can do is change the behavior. So how do you atone for the dysfunctional behavior that you have ever acted upon or acted in? This is why we need Mashiach for salvation, because without his atonement for the garbage that we've done, and without his helping us to change and become the person we ought to be, we can't be saved. Because it's his righteousness that covers our unrighteousness. Okay, you have to understand this, the fact that God teaches us in the Torah that with relationship to our unrighteous behavior, God demands that there would be an atonement for that unrighteous behavior. Well, there's only two ways to have that atonement take place. Either A, you die and you get destroyed, or something dies for you and is able to cover the wrong you did, but the requirement requires that you do teshuvah. So the teshuvah is the state by which you have to physically change your behavior. So when we look at Mashiach Yehoshua, we first, just in the state of our lack of understanding anything, we have to come to realize we need something to atone for our dysfunctionality. We need something to atone for the wrong that we have been stuck in, that said, I didn't get the fact that at the time that I was living in, from this point in the past all the way until this point now, that I was in fact a sinner, born in sin, by which God cannot accept any form of teshuvah without the atonement which is necessary to bring about the righteousness that I need. This is exactly what we find in the scriptures, that without Mashiach's atonement, God will look at every sin we've ever committed, even if we have tried to change, as if we are still an imperfect person that cannot function properly, that needs to be destroyed. That's exactly what he teaches us in Torah. Why? Because we can't sit there and demand that God change his mind on what the law should look like. When we're trying to sit there and justify ourselves, we're trying to say, okay, God, you have 613 commandments, and so what if I broke 200 of them? Now that I've changed my behavior, can you accept me in this state? He's going to say, are you crazy? Does the law allow me to have someone who's broken 200 of them justify themselves and make it look as if they did nothing wrong? You have to pay the penalty for the 200 things that you did wrong. So this is why we need Mashiach. Because why? Because he atones for the wrong we've committed. And his atonement is only applied to when the teshuvah is real. So that means we have to really take the active stance of not just believing in Mashiach, but accepting the fact that we have to physically change, and we do take the change. And that faith, as we see Yaakov talks us about, he says it's only made manifest and real when it's put into action. And therefore he says that our faith is proven by the state of the action that is motivated by the state of the faith. Therefore, he says, your faith has saved you, as we find Mashiach Yehoshua says time and time again throughout the Brit Chadashah. So, the understanding that we have to understand here, which is very vitally important, is knowing the fact that Mashiach Yehoshua's covenant has nothing to do with the Mosaic covenant. Anybody who sits here and tries to justify this belief by saying, well, the new covenant, and they misread Jeremiah 31, by which he says in Jeremiah 31 that God is going to give us a new covenant, not like the covenant which we failed, but he will give us a new covenant. They're misreading exactly what Jeremiah is talking about, first and foremost. Okay? God did not give the covenant at Mount Sinai in order to see if we would succeed. That wasn't why he gave the covenant. You have to first off get your brain put back in order and realize God said from the beginning, because of Adam and Chava falling into sin, that we are born in a state of sin. So that means he knew that we were always going to be dysfunctional as long as we are alive. And as long as we produce offspring, we're going to have dysfunctional children, we're going to have dysfunctional families, we're going to have a dysfunctional world. Okay? So he didn't give the covenant to sit there and say, oh, darn it, I tried to get you guys to be perfect by this law, but you broke it, now I got to make up a new covenant. That's not why he gave the covenant. He gave us the covenant for a different reason. And he gave only Israel this covenant. So let's go backwards and start from the beginning. So God sees man's born in sin. He tells us this in the scriptures. Man is born in sin. Why? Because Adam and Chava sinned. Every child from them forward are now going to be born with the same craziness as Adam and Chava had the minute they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So every child from that forward is just as crazy as Adam and Chava. We're all born in a state of absolute insanity. You have to understand this. We're all born in this state. So we think this is how we're going to live our life, because we're in this insane state. We create the clothing we're going to wear. We create the way we're going to socialize with others. We create all these stupid rules that really shows just how insane we are. Okay? Then we come to realize, because the Torah tells us this, that God gave Adam commandments. And the way that Adam was to raise his children after being pushed out of the garden was to remain in the commandments that he was given in the garden. And these commandments, we learn from the scriptures, are the Torah commandments. Now, for you people out there who don't really understand the fact that the Torah is not the 5 books of Moses all compiled together, and that it's the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic law, you have to understand this. There are Torah laws, and then there's the covenant of Moses. Okay? Big difference. Major difference. God says Abraham kept his Torah. What does he mean, his Torah? The Torah wasn't given, if you're looking at it from the Jewish standpoint and from the non-believer Jewish point of view, the Torah was not physically given until Mount Sinai. Okay? So this is what we have to prove, the point that the Torah is not talking about that the covenant of Moses was given to Abraham. This is not what happened. Okay? The Torah is saying is that God gave laws, and these instructions were the way we're supposed to live, keep, and follow, and obey by. So that means he gave us laws of how to eat. How do we know this? The Torah tells us in Genesis that when Noah was about to leave the ark, he had already known which animals were tahor and which animals were tameh. These animals by which we find our tahor and tameh are divided up based upon the standard that they used in regard to the actual burnt offerings that they would offer prior to entering into the ark. Okay, so they knew which animals were kosher because they were sacrificing these animals as offerings. So this wasn't like some brand new commandment that Noah got, that he was just like, oh, by the way, there's animals that are clean and unclean. They knew which animals were clean and unclean. This is the point the Torah wants us to understand. And then, of course, by definition, which many people who don't know their Torah, they don't get that Leviticus chapter 11 is giving you the details of what it is that you fill into the blank of what Noah knew. What animals were clean, how they were to be eaten, the slaughtering, because there's this false belief, this false ideology, this false understanding by literally looking at the Torah as if it's some progressive revelation, as if, well, there's this little thing over here that happened in Genesis, and this thing over here that happened in Genesis later on, and then there's this thing over here that happened in Exodus. This is not true, okay? Progressive theology is false when people are misconstruing the ideas of what the Torah says. What is the truth of progressive change. Progressive change is obviously the things we see in the Torah. Adam was allowed to eat everything but meat. So he could eat all the fruits, he could eat all the veggies, he could eat every single plant life that exists that was edible, and those things were for him to be for food. But could he eat meat? He was not given the authority to eat meat. But the Torah doesn't say, but you shall not eat meat. Because why? Because if the Torah had said it, then the Torah would be contradicting itself by allowing meat to be eaten later. So the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says, but you shall eat all these things. These things shall be food for you, and this is what you shall eat. So the Torah's, meaning God's law, had an opens clause. This is an escape clause that God used in order to create the ability in the future for them to actually eat meat. Therefore, we can see that if you're a lawyer out there, you know the law, you're not stupid. You realize the fact that in laws, there are certain standards and legalities that take place which allow for future changes to exist. This is exactly what was done. Although it was not permissible to eat it because he didn't say, and you can eat this, it was assumed by the statement of, and these are the things you shall eat, that you couldn't eat meat at the time. That's the assumption law. That would be considered the law of assumption. But when we get to the change that takes place with Noah, we find that all of a sudden the law changes. Why? Because now there's a different standard that God's creating in our world. What is this standard? Well, this standard applies to the fact of how we are going to learn about what we are to apply in our learning process and understanding through the access of actually slaughtering an animal and eating it. There is a law that we are to apply, some new learning by which it was required because of some spiritual changes that took place in the world. The Torah tells us that because of what happened during the time of Noah, the world became so flooded with falsehood, so flooded with a complete anti-law standard, anti-Torah, anti-following God's standard, that there had to be major changes that would cause the future to be ratified in a way that would cause anybody in the future to no longer fall away so quickly away from God's requirements. And so how did he do this? He says, this is how you're going to do it. If you're going to eat meat, you have to slaughter the meat and pour the blood upon the floor and then cover the blood. And this is going to be how you're going to go about learning about your need to be saved. Because why? Because what was taking place? Well, the salvation message was being lost during the days of Noah. Many people became apostates. They walked away from the truth. They walked away from the garden teaching. And so now the whole world was forced to say, because of this rebellion, because of the complete absolute depravity of the mindsets of the people, the whole world was required to live by a certain standard that would change the rest of the time periods in the forward motion because of how severe the problem was with what took place with the rebellion that took place with why the world was destroyed by a flood. And so when meat was permissible to be eaten, now there was a standard that was given which applied to how we were going to deal with it. So that what? Well, when we would slaughter the animal and pour the blood and then we're covering the blood, the questions would come about. Why are we covering this blood? What is it the Bible is trying to teach us by saying to us that we have to cover the physical blood? And the answer goes to show us that if we really figured out the answer, we'd realize to understand it's because the world was trying to cover up the sacrifice that Messiah would do in the future, that the world would try to cover up the atonement that we required to have, and that this was a symbol for us that we were given by God's commandment to learn from, so that we would not stay in a sinful state, but that we would see the pictures and that we'd learn to respond properly to them, and we'd learn to see our need for atonement. And so here we have the fact of the new law changes to the fact that we can eat meat. And the Torah requires certain standards. Now, you have the false belief within Judaism, which doesn't even interpret these things correctly. They create this whole fallacy of the Noahide law belief, which is just completely a farce. Okay? When we start out in the beginning of the Garden of Eden, every human being had to keep God's commandment. Well, that's a no duh, right? I mean, we can literally sit there and say, if Adam and Eve were the only two people in the world, and then after that they had children, I mean, it's so illogical to think that they would all be keeping different things of keeping, right? Because obviously, one God, one faith, one belief, one standard, everybody in the world had to keep it. But the things that changed is when we get to the time period of Abraham. And why? Well, the Bible is very specific and detailed and tells us why this took place. It was only Abraham's descendants, meaning the family that Abraham was related to, were the only ones who were faithful in a willingness to obey what God said. All the nations of the world completely abandoned the Torah. They abandoned God's way and they created their own religions. That's why we have Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Catholicism. That's why we have all the isms that we see in the world. It's because the families of the world abandoned God's Torah, they abandoned God's truth, and they decided, hey, we're going to follow our own path, we're going to follow our own religion, we're going to create our own version. So God said, you know what? Because Abraham's descendants and Abraham was faithful to continually walk in the ways of the truth, God wanted to set apart Abraham to become a peculiar and unique and special people. This gave him what we find in the Torah, the covenant of circumcision. Now, he established the covenant of circumcision with Abraham. But the Torah tells us that Abraham was not actually the only person ever circumcised. So to sit there and believe that the Torah tells us that Abraham was the only one circumcised, false. This is the first time circumcision was created as a standardized understanding of what a covenant was going to look like in a physical form with regard to a people. Because if we go backwards, the Torah teaches us that Noah was actually circumcised. And all the firstborns who walked in the ways of their father, they also were circumcised as well. It was not until God separated Abraham that he said that he would make circumcision a covenant, by which he and the offspring after him, which refers to Isaac, that they would walk in this specific standard that would set them apart from the world. Now, of course, no other nation was required to be circumcised. Even Ishmael, who was circumcised, was not a part of the physical covenant, because God said after that, he said, the offspring after you, he shall be a part of the covenant. So even though Ishmael was physically circumcised, he was never a part of the physical covenant. So it goes to show that it doesn't matter if a person's physically circumcised. It requires that if he's a part of the physical covenant. That's the standard that separates a person from a normal circumcised person versus a covenant-bearing circumcised person. And so we go from this point forward where it's Abraham is raising all of his children. Isaac raising Jacob, Jacob raising his 12 children raising their children, and they all are walking in the standard of this covenant. And so what takes place? Well, we start seeing the fact that Jacob, he goes and he marries Laban's two daughters, Leah and Rachel, and of course Bilhah and Zilpah. They become the wives, of Yaakov. And of course, while this time takes place and stuff, there is no standard by which people are thinking with relationship to this idea of thinking, well, they were a part of the Mosaic covenant. No, the Mosaic covenant didn't exist then. The only covenant that existed was the covenant of Abraham. So that means the women had to be willing to accept the standard of the covenant of Abraham in order to be married to these people. And this is what we find when we see that Jacob, when he was going to Shechem, that he tells the people of Shechem that the only way they will ever have marriage between them and their women and between their sons and their daughters is the fact that they have to be a part of the Abrahamic covenant. And that if they're not willing, if the women are not willing to be a part of this stance and belief and standard, well, then they are not going to be a part of the Echad, by which Yaakov represents. And then we find that as we move forward, that when we get to the fact of Yosef, what does Yosef marry? Yosef marries one of the daughters of the priest of On. Okay? And so when he takes this woman to become his wife, what does she do? Well, she obviously had to enter into the actual covenant with Yosef, so that she would raise the children in the same exact fashion, and that she would go and make sure that her children walked in the path that Yosef is walking, that she would teach the same path that Yosef was teaching, and that was the actual requirement. You could convert your own wife if she was willing to obey and walk in the ways of the standards. You can convert your own woman that you wanted to marry, and that was the way it was allowed to be done, and the Torah teaches us. So that's what Yosef did. She was willing, she accepted, and of course the children were a part of that same covenant. Yosef was circumcised, and so the children, because they accepted it, and we find this with regard to why God sexes us when we go backwards into looking with the issue of Abraham and Sarah, that Sarah had to be brought into the covenant as well. And how did she enter? By accepting it. By willing to accept it, she entered it, she became a part of the covenant, she willfully accepted the responsibility that was laid upon Abraham as well, and that is how both of them entered into that covenant relationship, by which nobody else could be a part of unless they desired and wanted to become a part of it. And of course, how did they enter? They entered by Yaakov and his children passing to them the information of how to be a part of the covenant. They willingly circumcised not just their physical body but their heart, so that they would enter into the same standard, the same belief, and that was how people entered. So when we look at the fact of Yosef had many disciples that he was raising up when he was in Mitzrayim, when he was in Egypt. And of course, when the brothers came down, they had many people that they had, that their disciples. So when we see the fact that what takes place is when Yaakov dies, that you see that there's a great mourning, as the Bible says in the book of Bereshit. And so all of these people who looked at Yaakov as such a very righteous and holy man who taught them the ways of Torah, they went up into a major ceremony into Israel to bury Yaakov with his father, so that Yaakov was now laid to rest in Israel, and many people that honored and showed respect and showed the same stance were the ones who went with, obviously, Yosef and his brothers. So when we get to the time period of Egypt, we start seeing the fact that as Exodus starts to come about, you see the Kedusha of the people is dropping. The standards of what Yosef lived by, what Judah lived by, Issachar, Zebulun, is not the same standard as what the people are doing. They're becoming very a part of the secular society of Mitzrayim. They become a part of the immoral society of Mitzrayim. They became a part of the spiritual society of Mitzrayim. And at that point, the Bible tells us that the Kedusha was so low that then all of a sudden arose persecution. Now the persecution rises. There's Jews being slaughtered left and right, many children being put to death. And we see a very horrific event taking place in Mitzrayim. And then there rises Moshe, who is a prophet. He rises up. He's a young man. He has been taught and is being taught the things of God. He begins to try to draw the people back to trying to keep Torah, but they don't want to listen to him. They don't want to hear what they have to say. And ultimately, he has to flee Egypt because Pharaoh wants to seek out his life. So Moshe goes and he flees, and he goes to Midian. And of course, when he goes to Midian, what happens? Well, once again, Moshe does everything just like his fathers did. They took a woman who is willing to accept the Torah, and remember, we're not talking about Mosaic covenant yet. We haven't even gotten there yet. So we're talking about the Abrahamic covenant was all that existed for the children of Abraham. Okay, so she willingly accepted the covenant of Abraham. She willingly accepted to be a part of it, and that she wanted to raise her children in the same fashion, in the same manner. And of course, now you see Moses has a wife, he has 2 children, and then God calls Moses to go back to Egypt. Well, as God calls Moses to go back, Moses is encountered by God at Mount Sinai. As he's encountered by God at Mount Sinai, a major, huge event takes place. And what is this major, huge event? God enters into a covenant with Moses. This covenant he enters with Moses is not like the covenant he entered with his father Abraham. Moses is given new ways of living, new standards that God holds him to that are higher and greater in accountability in which he is supposed to keep and do. He always has had to keep the issue of the covenant of circumcision because that's what his father Abraham had. So Moses, he has a new standard of things that he's keeping and doing that none of the generations before kept and did. He goes down to Mitzrayim, he goes to the eldership, he goes to the leadership, and he tells the leaders to do teshuvah, to repent. He shows the signs and wonders, and the leaders, which were very few, did teshuvah. They saw there was need to change, there was need to listen to Moshe, there's need to listen to Aaron, and then we find the miraculous events that began to transpire in Egypt. We find that Israel, while they were in Egypt, were given new commanded stances they were going to keep. They all had always kept Passover, but they didn't always keep Passover in the manner that we find Moshe speaks of. Moshe says they're going to be at this one-time event they're going to do. They're going to bring the lamb in their home. They're going to slaughter the lamb in their home. They're going to put the blood on the doorpost of their house. So when they put the blood on the doorpost of the house, they find that this is a very unique event. It's a one-time event that takes place. And the fact that also the issue is, with regard to the eating of the lamb, they learn that no person is allowed to partake of the lamb who is not circumcised. That this was a requirement that was given, by which teaches us that nobody who is not circumcised is allowed to be a part of this. So this part here we see actually is reiterating the reality of what starts to take place with relationship to the expounding of what was really the covenant of Abraham. So the covenant of Abraham, we learn from this, is the fact that he was teaching about eating the Passover. Okay? But the thing that was different was the fact that Moses instituted something that was never a part of the Passover Seder, and that was the physical lamb. The physical lamb was never part of the Passover Seders in the past. It was only bitter herbs, it was matzah, and of course the meal. Those are the things we find are the only ways that they kept Passover in the past. So the Passover lamb was this new additive that was a part that made Israel distinct at this time. And at this point, Moshe goes to tell them that no Gentile can partake of the Passover lamb. So in the past, we know that if we go back to Lavan, we know Lavan, he ate the matzah, he had the wine, he also had, of course, the festive meal that was partaking of the Passover, knowing about the deliverance from bondage. But here we find in the book of Shemot, there's a new added law, which starts to be added to only the Jewish people. Never was this law allowed upon any Gentile people. They had to partake of the covenant of Moses in order to be a part of this very thing. And so we start to see that there's this change that starts to take place where now Israel's having new added things, and these new added things happen to be different laws that apply to what we see later on as we get to finally Mount Sinai, which apply directly to the issue of bringing an actual sacrifice to the actual tabernacle. And so we learn that when we finally get to Mount Sinai and we get to the point of what God does at Mount Sinai, what God does with Israel, what God does with Moses, Moses enters the people into the covenant. The covenant requires only Israel and only those who are physically of the seed of Abraham to be a part of this physical covenant. They're required because they accepted it. They willfully, as a nation, acknowledge that they will be part of it. They will keep and do everything the Torah says. And of course, at this point in moment, we find that the Torah goes to point out that now Israel is made even more distinct than Abraham was made distinct, because now we find the actual Passover lamb is going to be eaten. We see the fact that the tabernacle is set up, which makes Israel very distinct and different, because now that the tabernacle is set up, everything centers around a temple size worship, by which everything is collaborating in this issue of the tabernacle being used, the sacrificial system being initiated, which never existed at all in human history. We see that there was never a sacrifice for sin whatsoever during the days of Abraham. There was never a sacrifice for sin anytime during the days of Joseph. There was never a sacrifice for sin until we get to the Mosaic covenant. So when we get to the Mosaic covenant, what happens? We see the fact that Israel is absolutely set apart as a nation, and that the only way for any other nation to become physically a part of Israel requires two specific things. Either A, you circumcise your heart and repent and return back to the original Torah, which was given to Adam, and you follow it, and you abide by that standard, living side by side with Israel, living in agreement with the God of Israel and with the people, knowing the fact that you are serving the same God and serving the same standard. Or B, you entered into the Mosaic covenant in addition to doing teshuvah and keeping the Torah laws that the whole world was to keep. And therefore, if you did so, you were called a ger, and that ger status required you to have the same standard that you had to keep with relationship to the sacrifices, with relationship to bringing offerings to the tabernacle, with relationship to all of the standards that required you to do any kind of service near or at the actual tabernacle itself. Whereas the other, which is called a ger toshav, he was only to keep the Torah laws. This meant he had to keep the dietary laws, he had to keep the laws of separating himself from his wife when she's bleeding, he had to keep the standard of keeping the Sabbath, he had to keep the standard of modesty, wearing clothing, everything that applied in the basic forms of God's commandments. And this is what we find is what happens in reality of the Torah. Now, let's get to the actual problems of the one law issue. Well, the one law issue is negating the belief that God has set a covenant only with Israel. And the actual one law issue is like, what it does is it tries to assimilate without even expressing it. People who believe in the one law, you have to understand the problem of it. Not only is their thinking completely wrong and incorrect, but it contradicts every single thing they're saying. They try to make it look like the whole Torah was given to the world, and that they enter it by believing in Messiah. Okay? So they're making Messiah as the part by which people enter into the actual physical Torah covenant, which is the commandments that apply all throughout the whole book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? So they're using the 5 books of Moses as the standard that you have to live because of your faith in Jesus. False. Jesus never entered us into the covenant of Moses. Jesus is his own set covenant. This covenant is the covenant of teshuvah. God's laws are binding, period. Okay? It's like the difference between the military guys and the guys who are civilians. Okay? Do I have to hold to a military standard of living if I'm not in the military? The answer is no. I am to hold to the civilian standards of living. Okay? So as long as I'm just a civilian, I'm only under civilian law. I'm not under military law. When I enter the military, now I'm under the military code of justice by which I'm going to be held by the UMJC. So by being under the UMJC, I'm now applied to every single law that is requiring me to keep the standard that I'm to keep by being in the military. Okay? It's the same thing you find with Jews. Jews are to keep what you could look at as the military code of justice. Okay, it's the Jewish law. It's the laws that require them to abide in a certain standard and a certain way of living that is separate from civilians. Civilians don't have the same requirements. They don't have the same standards. But do not military people have the same requirement to abide under the same rules as civilians? Yes, they do. Can a military guy drive 60 billion thousand miles down the road and ignore the speed limit? No, he can't. Can a military guy go into a store and arm rob the store? No, he can't. It's the same rules. The only distinction is when he's on base and when he's off base, he has to and conduct himself according to the UMJC. This is the problem that you find with people who believe in the one law belief, is they're wiping away the covenant of Moses and they're applying it to themselves. And so now there really isn't a Jew anymore. They say there is. They make it look like, well, God made a covenant with Israel. Well, God made a covenant with the Jewish people. The Jewish people are distinct. But really, they're not when you think of the one law belief. Because now, if everybody has to keep the Torah, everybody has to keep the law, well, now you've just made it into the standard that everybody is under the same code of justice and the same code of keeping. Okay, when yet God made specifically the commandment that circumcision was not required upon anybody except those who enter into the covenant of Abraham. And especially that the covenant of Moses does not apply to any Gentile unless he becomes a part of the physical covenant. So what they're doing is they're wiping along the Y's, they're just wiping away the lines and trying to say that you have to keep everything. And that no, there's really no distinction of a Jew anymore. Matter of fact, Jews really don't have any kind of standard anymore because, well, you have the same standard as them. So you can go to the temple, you can go and bring sacrifices just like them, which is completely absurd. The Torah makes it very clear that no Gentile was allowed to enter inside the tabernacle as well. So what's the false argument they create? Well, they say, well, those are heathens. Those are people that are uncircumcised in the heart. They're the ones who are not allowed to enter. This is false. The Torah says very clearly that the people who are not allowed to enter the tabernacle are people who are not a part of the covenant of Moses. And that would apply to a Ger Toshav. A Ger Toshav, even though he is keeping the Torah standard, the commandments of God, he is not permitted to go into the tabernacle because he's not a part of the covenant of Moses. And so this is a grave fallacy that's going on. Well, what does the two-house theory do? The two-house theory changes everything in its diametrics. And what it's basically doing is it's doing this, okay? The two-house theory is saying, well, the reason you're drawn to Torah is because you're one of the lost tribes of Israel. And that, therefore, it's really you were a Jew. Well, they won't use the term Jew. They'll say Israelite because Jew is only from the tribe of Judah. This is the semantics they use. And therefore, the reason you're drawn back to the law is because you're really one of the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, so where's the Gentiles now? There's no Gentiles whatsoever? I mean, this is what happens, is the whole Gentile line is now completely blurred away, and it's really anybody who comes to want a desire to keep the Torah, he was just an automatic Israelite, he just didn't know who he is, he just didn't remember what tribe he is, because, according to their belief, these people just walked away at some point in history and just all of a sudden, boop, forgot who they were, and they didn't remember they were Jews anymore, and they just lived like the nations. And so the reason why you're turning back and desiring to keep Torah is because, well, you were a Jew. This is false. It's the same thing as the one Torah theology. It's still creating this belief that everybody has to keep the Torah. And that's exactly what it's doing. It doesn't define anybody as a Gentile, really. Matter of fact, Gentile is being defined in both circles as just heathens, which is completely not true, okay? The term Gentile just means a person who is not of the nationality of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay? The term Goy, why is the term Goy ever used when it refers to a negative terminology is only when it's being applied to those people who've tried persecuting Jews. Okay? And they say, well, the Goyim are always trying to come against us, and they're trying to harm us, they try to stop us from keeping Shabbat. And that's only because it's being used because it's replying to the nations that are surrounding them that are trying to stop them. Well, that doesn't mean the term goy is just a bad word, okay? It's not a bad word. Just like the term am haaretz is not a bad word in itself. It's how it's applied. If you talk about am haaretz, it refers to just the generalization of the people that are of that land. But it can be used in a negative terminology, such as a debased person who doesn't follow the commandments of God. That can be used exactly as a negative term. But it doesn't mean that it's a negative term in itself. Okay? It's just like the term black or white. It's not a negative term in itself, but it can be used in a negative terminology based upon the context the person is deciding to use it in. And therefore, we have to understand correctly what's really going on. So the one Torah belief is exactly equivalently connected to the two-house theology. The only differentiation is the two-house theology is making you think, well, you were just really a lost Jew, Israelite, who somehow came to come about and realized who you really were, and that's why you're drawn to Torah. Versus the one law theology says, well, we're all of us supposed to keep because, well, Jesus entered us into the covenant. And that's what the one law belief is doing. It tries to make everybody believe that this is it. But these are both false beliefs. They are false theologies based upon nothing. There's no thing whatsoever that establishes, that even connects it, that even upholds it, that even allows it to be even anywhere near the truth. It's just fallacy. And the people who ascribe to this belief only do so to their own detriment. And so we have to realize and understand in truth that what's really going on here. Well, when you accept this standard and belief, you're basically turning the world into a standard by which anybody can interpret the Torah. That's what you're doing. Because the way the Torah is to be interpreted is based upon the fact that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, He gave the Torah to Israel, and God requires that they know the Torah properly. Matter of fact, we can find in the book of Romans that Paul says specifically, he says, what gain is there in circumcision? What gain? That's a very important statement. What gain is there in circumcision? All right? And then he goes to say, and what profit is there? He says, well, it's because God gave Israel the law. He gave Israel the whole Torah. He gave Israel all of the oracles of God. And therefore, they're the ones who are the only ones who will be able to properly understand and interpret the Torah. That it's Israel's obligation to teach the nations what the Torah says. It's Israel's obligation to teach the issues of the covenants what the Torah says, so that nobody's confusing things. And this is why it's so important that you don't sit here and confuse things. Your belief in Jesus, your belief in Mashiach Yehoshua, is not entering you into the Mosaic covenant. Your belief in Mashiach Yehoshua is entering into you the heart change that says you're a sinner, and without Jesus, you will not be atoned. The teshuvah is the calling that says, go back and do the things that you were obligated to keep. Okay? So, that's what Mashiach does. He calls us to go back and to keep the things we were already obligated to keep. Well, if you're not a Jew, you're not obligated to keep the Mosaic covenant. You're not obligated to keep the Mosaic standard. This is why Acts 15 was such a major problem. Because the question that was being asked in Acts 15 was, what do we do with these Gentiles? Because this was not a common thing we see in Israel's history. Now that Gentiles are coming to believe and they're wanting to do teshuvah, do we require them to keep the Mosaic law, or do we not require them to keep the Mosaic law? What does the Torah teach? And they said, we don't require them to keep the Mosaic law. They are required to keep the Torah. And so we need to teach them the Torah and what the Torah says. But when it comes to the Mosaic covenant issues, we show them that this is the distinction between our standard of living and their standard of living. Remember this. This is very simple. Jews, like I said, have the requirement to keep the Torah. In addition to the Torah, they have the requirement to keep the Mosaic covenant. And I said, what's the equivalent? It's the same equivalent as saying an American citizen has the requirement to keep all the laws as an American citizen. But a person in the military is not under the same standard as that of an American citizen. Because why? Because they have to keep more laws in addition to the common everyday citizen laws they have to keep in the country. And that's the same thing we find with Jews. Jews have to keep more in addition to the same laws the Gentiles have to keep. So the reality that we have to really label down here is this dysfunctionality that's being taught incorrectly. And that's the fact that they're causing people to think that you have to be a part of the Mosaic covenant. And that's trying to wipe away the standard of who is a Jew. And that's also trying to wipe away the standard of what makes Israel distinct. You see, if you want to become a part of the Mosaic covenant, fine. The Torah says you're permitted. You go to the Jews, you tell them you want to become a part of the covenant with them, and bam, you become a part of the covenant with them. They enter you into it. They teach you how to keep it. They show you how to live the lifestyle, and you live with them, and you live in accordance to what they're saying. Now, when it comes to the Torah laws, who do you go to? Well, you don't go to Gentiles to say, hey, what does the Torah say? What does the Torah teach? You go to a Jew. The Torah says God gave all of the commandments in the Torah to Jews. Because why? Because they're the only family in the world that was willing to stand up and keep God's commandments when the rest of the world decided to apostate and follow other religions and other beliefs. So to sit here and to have a standard that goes against what the Torah teaches is just, you're fighting against yourself. You're going to lose this battle. And you're going to end up just being in apostasy. That's what you're going to end up being. And so we have to truly understand the reason as to why things are messed up. You want to know why churches are so messed up? Because they don't follow the Jewish people who taught in the New Testament, who taught the prophets, who were teaching the Torah. They're not following them. They would never have gotten caught up in Christmas and Easter and Sunday and all the other garbage stuff that they were part of if they followed the Jewish people who believe and who keep the Torah and who keep the commandments and who follow the prophets. They never would have gone astray from that. So we have to understand the reality, the fact of, why is there so many religions in the world? It's because you're looking at all the families that rebelled against God. Only God in heaven is the one that we're to follow. Only His words are the ones we're to keep. And the reason why this world is so messed up is because this world has been in rebellion since the families walked away from the truth. And there's only one family God holds so accountable, and that's the Jewish people, because He said, I want you to be a light to the world and get them to see that they need to do teshuvah. I want you to encourage them to know the truth so that they can know what they're supposed to be keeping, they can know the way they're supposed to be living, and that I'm going to hold you accountable, He says, so that when you make a mistake and when you fail, He holds them accountable, and when the nations make a mistake and they fail, God holds them accountable. But He says the light shall come forth from Israel. The light shall come forth from the Jewish people. This is why Mashiach Yehoshua had to come forth from the Jewish people, because He is the true light of the world, and He is the true peace and the prosperity and the hope. So that's why we want to do everything we can to get people to be restored back to the truth. We want to do everything we can to get people to see the reality of what's going on and what are these false doctrines made up in. They come in so many different varieties, they come in so many different packaging, but we have to get down to the point of narrowing it down to show the real source of it, to show that both of these theologies are false and wrong, and there's a reason why we have to understand this so that you will not be led astray. Because let's be frank here, okay? Is Mashiach Yehoshua dying for our sins? Did He die to turn us away from a lawless lifestyle? Did He die to turn us away from wrong? Or did He die in order to bring you into the Mosaic covenant? Which is it? He died for my sins, or He died to bring me in the Mosaic covenant? Because you can't have both, okay? He didn't die for my sins and to bring me in the Mosaic covenant. He died for my sins to cause me to do teshuvah. The Mosaic covenant only applies for Jews. This doesn't make any logical sense why anybody would want to choose these doctrines and even go in the direction of these doctrines and sit there and say, hey, you're a Gentile. Now all of a sudden you're going to keep all these Mosaic laws. You're going to now be forced to keep all these laws and be bred into this mesmerizing false doctrinal, let's sit here and program and brainwash you into thinking that you have to keep the Mosaic law and be a Jew now. This is just preposterous. It's ridiculous, okay? Mashiach Yehoshua, he entered us into the new covenant, which is a covenant of faith by which his death was so he could atone for the sin and for the lack of what I have struggled with in my life, which is that constant entity, that constant attitude, that constant stance that has caused me to struggle with keeping God's commandments, which has caused me to struggle with knowing the fact that I cannot in any way, shape, or form make myself righteous before God. This is why Mashiach died, so in order to bring me into that relationship back with God. And so when you're trying to tell a Gentile that he's either A, now one of the lost tribes of Israel, now he's going to keep all the Torah laws, or B, you're going to say that, well, you've had to keep the Torah laws from the beginning, and you need to be circumcised because circumcision wasn't a covenant. You have just destroyed everything the Torah stands for. And you've destroyed everything the New Testament stands for, and you've destroyed everything the prophets taught. And this, my friend, is why I refuse to be silent, and that I will speak up in order to encourage you so that you may believe the truth and know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I'll see you next time.